It's one for the generations. Perhaps. President Donald Trump has nominated Brett Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court. If the Senate approves, he'd replace Justice Anthony Kennedy, who's been the court's swing vote for nearly 2 decades. Kavanaugh is widely understood to be far more conservative than Kennedy, and many believe he will shift the court to the right. What's at stake? Abortion, same-sex marriage, healthcare? Could be any of those, could be others. We're talking with the president of Marist College, whose legal career includes arguing a case before the Supreme Court. Lots to talk about, so let's get started.
And hi, everybody. This is Poll Hub. I'm J.D. Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Mergoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
There have been a lot of big decisions that have been made by this president that have raised lots of concerns and lots of joy on both sides of the aisle. He has done a lot of things that have gotten a lot of attention. This one is arguably the one that would have the most lasting impact because naming a Supreme Court justice to replace the swing vote, and Justice Kennedy's been the swing vote for 2 decades now, and naming a guy who is young by Supreme Court standards, meaning he could serve for the next 30 years or 40 years if he wants to hang on like Justice Brennan did, could really have a long-lasting impact for generations to come. We have been asking questions, Barbara, about the Supreme Court, about how people feel about it, how the public feels about it. Where does the public stand coming into this, what is likely to be a big battle?
Yeah, us and, of course, lots of pollsters, lots of national pollsters have been really tracking what Americans think about the court, their confidence in the court, and how they like the court to progress. Just in February, we looked overall at the institution of the Supreme Court and found that nearly 6 in 10 Americans do have confidence in the court, which is quite high.
That's higher than practically any other institution.
And certainly if you compare it to the other 2 institutions, the other 2 branches of government, the Congress and the President, the plurality of Americans actually think that the Supreme Court or give them the most trust and feel that that they are far and above more or less, I should say, political than the other branches of government. Also, Bloomberg poll has shown that the Supreme Court has had a favorable rating. 2/3 of Americans have a positive rating about the Supreme Court, and a plurality actually feel that in terms of their decisions over time, that they have been about right. You have 3 in 10 Americans feeling that the court is too liberal, about 1 in 5 saying it's too conservative, but the plurality feeling that the court has moved the country in the right direction. Now, when it comes to the next justice, that's where you really see the lack of consensus. 21% of Americans would like to see that next justice to be someone who is more liberal than the court is now. 36% want someone who will be middle of the road, and not surprisingly, 1/3 want the next justice to be more conservative and don't want the Democrats to disrupt the nomination process. However, that said, when we look at the issues and what Americans think on those issues that the court may be actually dealing with in the next couple of months and years to come, like Roe v. Wade, immigration, guns, same-sex marriage, the court really is out of step with public opinion. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how these things change over time.
And that's a real switch from the 50s and 60s when the court was widely believed and seen to be way ahead of public opinion. Things like interracial marriage and schools.
Civil rights.
Whole bunch of stuff. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we're happy to have joining us now the president of Marist College, David Yellen. The reason he's here today, aside from the fact he's president of Marist College,
he can come anytime.
He can come anytime he wants. And actually, Actually, he's the next building over.
Yes, we're not reimbursing for mileage on this one. But anyway, so background clearly in law, a graduate of Cornell Law School, has been a member of the faculty and dean of Hofstra Law School and dean and professor of law at Loyola of Chicago School of Law. So very happy to have you here, David. And let's start off. Judge Kavanaugh, what are we to make of this?
Well, he's obviously a highly credentialed judge, elite academic credentials, longtime member of the D.C. Republican establishment. He is someone who you could imagine virtually any Republican president today nominating. So in that sense, it's really a very mainstream Republican nomination, I think.
Yeah, I was struck that not having had that background myself, but having looked and read about him since, he's really come down a very similar path, having gone to an Ivy League law school, clerk on the court, D.C. experience, and then also being a judge on the court. It's sort of like it's the way you go when you want to end up on the Supreme Court. So this is not a pick that's off the charts in terms of his resume anyway.
There's been a lot of talk for 10 or 15 years now about maybe the court should have some members with different background, not Ivy League educated, trial lawyer, a bunch of different things.
Maybe not even a lawyer. Wasn't Howard Taft, after he was the president, was then appointed to the Supreme Court, and I don't believe he was a lawyer, was he?
Oh, I thought he was a lawyer.
Was he a lawyer?
But
okay.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would appoint a non-lawyer, no.
Because that counts all of us out except for you. So.
Well, and I'm not getting appointed
But a politician as opposed to...
Well, sure, exactly. There was a tradition decades ago, that people who had political background could sometimes be appointed to the court, and there were arguments for George Mitchell, for example, for that reason. And Republican presidents have considered a few people of that mold, but the last handful of choices have all been these Ivy League pedigreed, parallel but fairly narrow paths on the right and left.
President Trump actually said at one point he'd like allegedly said that at one point he'd like someone from either Yale or Harvard, and he actually had said that. So he was actually in that case tipping,
or perhaps tweeted.
Yeah, or tweeted. Yes, tipping his hand perhaps on that one. So as Jay alluded to in his opening remarks. There's probably a good size of the country right now who's very concerned, and a good size of the country right now who is popping the champagne over this. And we're facing a battle perhaps,
and a plurality in the middle that isn't really sure what to make of it.
But is this going to be a tipping point for the court in terms of some of the policies that Barb and Jay alluded to? Are we, if Kavanaugh is selected and wins the battle of the Senate, can we be looking at a tipping point? Are both of those sides going to be either thrilled or dismayed?
Yeah, well, this is a critical nomination for two reasons. One is still the lingering effects of the Senate not taking up President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland, which led to the Gorsuch appointment. That obviously still is a really big deal to Democrats. The second is that we've had a very closely divided court for a long time, and now with Justice Kennedy's retirement, if a stauncher conservative is confirmed, and Judge Kavanaugh clearly seems to fit that bill. The main question about Judge Kavanaugh, is he more in the Chief Justice Roberts mode ultimately, or is he more in the Justice Alito or Justice Gorsuch mode? But either way...
The first being more towards the center, I guess. Right of center.
Slightly more to the center, more concerns about institutional issues, a little more restrained rather than a stronger proponent of originalism. So no one knows. You can't tell with an appellate court judge who hasn't had tons of constitutional decisions how they're going to become as a Supreme Court justice. But he's clearly a very conservative judge, and that means there'll be 5 if he's confirmed, or if anyone President Trump appoints is confirmed, frankly, there'll be 5 strongly conservative justices. And that has big implications for new issues that come up to the court,
As
and
well
also
as-
whether they'll revisit some of the hot button issues. Roe versus Wade is obviously, at the top of that list, and also same-sex marriage and a lot of things, the hot button issues of recent years. Where will he come down on those when they come up? Will he be an originalist who says we're going back to what I think the Constitution meant all along? Will he show more restraint and say precedent calls for stare decisis, calls for leaving alone those past issues, but he'd rule more conservatively on future issues? Just can't know right now. But clearly it would make this a much more solidly conservative court than we've had in generations.
And lasting for some time, presumably, given the age of who the court are, and the potential for even more picks under the Trump administration.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now we're about to see this become very politicized, in our public discussion of this confirmation process. How can Americans look at this in perhaps a more rational way than hearing the noise from both sides? The fact that he's going to destroy everything that has been worked for from the Democratic side, and how he's going to reach the promised land from the right and the more conservative side.
Well, like I said, you have to view this in the context of those two key factors, the Merrick Garland nomination and Anthony Kennedy's role on the court. There's no way this choice was not going to be highly politicized, no matter what. If you look at the arc of nominations in our lifetimes, some very conservative and very liberal justices have come through very smoothly with near unanimous votes of support.
Scalia,
Ginsburg.
Justice Ginsburg, for example, both of them, the opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, I wanted to also get into that, but let's continue on this line of thought, because it's so different now than it was.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure we'll have nominations with some future president in a future time that are less controversial, less political than things are right now. But given the stakes, there's no way this isn't going to be highly politicized, and that means that partisans on all sides are going to be looking to make their case as aggressively as possible.
And they're already lining up.
Well, some people have actually characterized the confirmation process as actually broken.
Yeah, it's broken sometimes. Sometimes it works very well. The show of the senators asking all of these questions that are generally prepared by their staff, and only a few of the senators, I think, really understand the issues in great depth. And now nominees have gotten incredibly adept at saying little or nothing. So, it doesn't serve a great purpose the way the confirmation hearings work nowadays. If you wanted to lower the heat on this, I think probably the best thing to do, which some experts have proposed, is to shift from lifetime tenure on the Supreme Court to 18-year terms. Now, the Constitution says that federal judges get appointed for life, but it doesn't say that someone appointing to one particular court gets to stay there for life. And imagine, would it be a better situation if Supreme Court justices had 18-year terms? And the reason for 18 would be that...
Yeah, I was curious.
Well, it would mean that
it's
every
a nice
other...
number.
But every other year, one justice would get off the Supreme Court, which means that every 4-year presidential cycle, there'd be 2 picks for the Supreme Court. That would probably lower the heat pretty considerably, and I think it's an idea really worth considering. But whoever has the advantage isn't going to want to.
And I think part of the thinking behind that also is when the founders put this all together, they didn't really anticipate. I mean, people didn't live into their 70s, 80s, and 90s as much, and the idea of, let's say, a judge serving 20 or 30 years was really not the mindset. So maybe, and then also we don't get into the kind of the back and forth of, is an election coming and can you make an appointment?
Absolutely.
And that would all go away. So it's something to certainly weigh. It'd be a very different day for this nomination process.
Do you think in looking back throughout not all of the Supreme Court's history since John Jay, we don't have to go back that far, but is this actually a historically divided and divisive court, and is it one that is historically more political or becoming more political than we've seen in the past?
I'm not. You could have better experts than me on that, but my sense of it is that I think there are more 5-4 decisions that are predictably along ideological lines now than there have ever been before. So if that's the measure, how often do the Democrats line up on one side and the Republicans line up on the other, sometimes Justice Kennedy having been the swing vote. This is a fairly unique time in that regard.
Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing for democracy?
Well, I don't know how it can be a good thing that the Supreme Court be seen more and more as an extension of other forms of politics. I don't know the solution to it, but the value of the court system and the Supreme Court in particular is the appearance or reality that it's different than the political branches.
Well,
of
it still
government.
has that mystical quality in the fact that we treat
we think so.
the arguments, the oral arguments, we don't see it televised. There's all kinds of things that still hold it back. You argued a case in front of the Supreme Court. Is there that mystical quality when you're standing in those chambers?
Oh, absolutely. Even just when you go visit it, as a tourist, or I've been back many times since I argued, either to see other arguments or to, when I was a dean at Loyola Law School, we would every few years bring some alums to the court to be sworn in as members of the bar in open court.
How cool.
And for a lawyer, and I hope for any citizen, it really is it's a sacred sort of place.
Well, for political science pollsters, it's sort of like the New Hampshire primary. It's election night. I mean, this is kind of like where it happens. If you're a baseball
also,
fan, it's Yankee Stadium. So
Keep going with those analogies.
As part of your role as dean, you also got to know some of the justices as well. And can you talk a little bit about your observations on the relationships that they had with each other? Because, again, we think of it being very political. We think of it as being a very divided court. Are these people that can actually, be in the same room with each other and have a conversation?
unlike in the Senate
Scalia
sometimes.
and Ginsburg, we only learned later.
Well,
David knew
that's
both.
the most famous example.
And you know both. You knew both of them.
Yeah, I hosted several times for week or two long summer law school sessions in nice European places, both Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia, so I knew them both pretty well. And they're the classic story of people who could hardly be more dissimilar in terms of their approach to being a justice on the Supreme Court, and even personal style-wise, yet they were the closest of friends. They really loved each other as human beings. They spent holidays together. They were really very close to one another on all kinds of levels. And there are other pairings on the court that cross ideological lines in a similar way. Not all of them get along with everyone. They're human beings, and sometimes there are ruffled feathers. Justice Scalia was particularly tart often in how he expressed himself, and I know that annoyed some of the other members of the court. But at the end of the day, they are overwhelmingly able to set aside their deep ideological and jurisprudential differences and interact as human beings who care about each other.
Respected, and I know that in the U.S. Senate that was the case, and now it's kind of gone down that road where
is
and that
widely seen to have disappeared
there.
The
honorable
senator
from such and such.
From what you understand?
Yeah, from what I understand, no, it hasn't changed. I mean, they don't socialize a lot, I don't think, but I think they generally have really good relations with one another.
Is that where the hope is then? I mean, if we look at this as a rather dystopian time of the court where it's getting more political and perhaps it's losing some of its luster in the public, and I'm not talking right or left, just in general, it becomes more part of the political stew and morass, is the hope that 9 individuals can still get along and maybe make this work?
I think that's certainly way better than the alternative.
Chaos.
I don't think it changes much about how the Supreme Court goes about deciding cases, but sure, it would be a much worse situation if it were known that the justices couldn't stand each other.
So let me just get into the nitty-gritty just a second on the people are going to be interested in your views on what derails nominations or what gets nominees through the process. Already we're hearing about that article that was written in the 2009 about whether presidents can be, are they distracted by civil lawsuits or criminal investigations? And that's obviously something that may become—
Can you indict a sitting president?
Yes. Part of what we're about to hear a lot of in these hearings. In the past, we have had justice nominees get derailed. I mean, is there sort of a thing to watch out for, or does it have to do just with the composition of the Senate?
Yeah, I think it's much more the latter.
Okay.
I mean, the last time someone was rejected because of their substantive views on what they would do as a Supreme Court justice was Robert Bork.
Which is how we got Anthony Kennedy, who
Yeah,
we're now replacing.
As to this particular matter of what Judge Kavanaugh said about indicting a sitting president, when he was a young lawyer, he worked for Ken Starr in the investigation of President Clinton, and obviously at that time he thought it was perfectly okay to potentially indict a sitting president. Later, when he worked in the Bush White House, he changed his mind and concluded that it would be better for the country if sitting presidents couldn't be indicted during their term of office. However, this couple of articles that he wrote, he said that Congress should pass a law to that effect, basically saying that implies that constitutionally a president could be indicted, and it would take an act of Congress to shield a president from indictment. Now, that runs against what a couple of Justice Departments have concluded, that a sitting president can't be indicted. The truth is no one knows because it's never come up. But I don't think first of all, it shows, Judge Kavanaugh can change his mind. Now, maybe it's because he went from investigating President Clinton to supporting President Bush. But regardless, his argument was not. He has never, I don't think, said that the Constitution forbids a sitting president from being indicted. It's just he thinks that it would be a good idea to take that off the table by act of Congress. So, fast forwarding, if he's confirmed, and if Robert Mueller attempts to indict President Trump, I don't think Judge Kavanaugh has indicated clearly how he would rule on the propriety of,
and all this
that
may
indictment.
occur chronologically very much at the same time.
I
mean, we
think
may be looking at an incredibly intense Mueller report, hearings.
Yeah,
I mean, the whole thing could be
confirmation
within 24 hours
But
of
I
each
think
other.
I think it's absolutely fascinating that the context of his comments is just so different than how they're being presented now as he's approaching this confirmation hearing, and the idea that it's in the context of his experience actually with President Clinton, and also the idea of whether or not it's really the court's role to do that.
Well, that's where the confirmation process doesn't put on a very pretty face, right? Many people who get to the point of being nominated to the Supreme Court have fairly nuanced views on a number of legal and constitutional questions. And senators of both parties are not likely to want to probe nuances. They want to caricature someone's views. And this is a bipartisan critique.
Absolutely.
But that's their job. Their job is not to conduct a Yale Law School constitutional law seminar. They're trying to either decide whether to vote for or against someone, or if they've already decided, to convince others to vote the same way. So that article by Judge Kavanaugh, it's good food for comment right now, but it doesn't
and cable
really
news.
Yeah, but it doesn't really indicate much
Anything.
other than what we just talked about.
If you were constructing a question for a senator, you're his chief of staff, or you're the one briefing him, and he or she, what would you ask, or what would you ask someone who is before you that's being nominated to the Supreme Court that wouldn't be one of these, kind of black and white kind of answers? Let's say for you're in a safe seat and you actually want to take the high road. What would you ask?
Well, let's put it in context of this nomination, where it's a Republican president nominating a conservative judge. So let's assume I was a Democratic senator. The thing I would really want to probe is does this nominee consider himself or herself to be an originalist? And what does that mean to them in terms of some important issues? And the problem is nominees are tending.
They're not going to answer.
A bunch of judicial nominees recently haven't even answered the question of whether Brown versus Board of Education was rightly decided. And for the reason is it's probably the case that if you are a true strict originalist, Brown versus Board of Education was not, quote unquote, properly decided. I heard Justice Scalia, he said that to me, that in his view, now he's said different things publicly, but at least in this private setting, he said as a matter of constitutional law, Brown versus Board was wrongly decided because that's not what the framers of the 14th Amendment had in mind. He also said he wouldn't overturn it because at this point it had become such settled law, and had Brown not been decided, the country has moved so far in that direction that the Constitution would have almost certainly been amended to reach that same result. So not all originalists would overturn every decision that they disagree with. But I would want to probe, what is this nominee's view of what originalism mean, and what is their view about stare decisis, meaning it basically is a legal principle that you give deference to prior decisions and don't just substitute your judgment as to what the right outcome would have been. So how quick would a nominee be to vote to overturn decisions that they would have voted differently on had they been on the court 10 or 20 or 40 years ago?
Which goes right to the heart of the biggest one that's being waved around, which is Roe v. Wade, which is 1973. It's a long time ago. Is
right.
it long enough ago? That would be a way to ask that question.
That's a $1 million, $1 billion question.
Today
right?
it's $1 billion of lobbying money. When it was passed, it was probably only $1 million.
Just one last thought. I'd like to get your thoughts about Justice Kennedy. There's a lot of discussion about his legacy.
Well, on the timing of his retirement, I met Justice Kennedy a couple times, but don't know him at all. So I have no idea if there were any political considerations. I've read the same things you have, that he, in some sense, negotiated with the Trump administration about who might replace him. I don't know if that's true or not. In terms of his legacy, Justice Kennedy was in general a very conservative justice who had a kind of libertarian streak and sort of a European streak.
What does that mean?
Well, in other words, a lot of constitutional jurisprudence in Europe deals with the concept of dignity, human dignity. And that's something that would make Justice Scalia's head spin because it's nowhere in
his grave.
Nowhere in the Constitution. Yeah. But it meant a lot to Justice Kennedy, which is why, for example, he was the deciding vote on same-sex marriage. Yeah. And some of his other quote-unquote liberal votes were not that he was a liberal, but that he was some libertarian in some sense, wanting to keep the government out of people's lives, and was apparently a believer in this concept of a broad-reaching concept of human dignity. We'll see whether over time, it won't be in the near term, whether that has any lasting legacy on the court. I don't know.
And one of the interesting things as a citizen watching the court is all the dissents and people writing about what the reason. We don't get that in Congress. We don't get that in the White House. I mean, in the Supreme Court, you lay out the reasons, and so there's this great paper trail of thought processes that make the court so different.
Absolutely, and that transparency makes it such a powerful institution.
Well, there's certainly a lot to talk about and a lot to watch. Thank you so much, President of Marist College, David Yellen. We very much appreciate your insightful analysis of all things legal and, I guess, supreme, and for joining us today.
Thank you.
And that'll do it for this episode of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll here at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. And our executive producer is Mary Griffith. And I do want to just correct myself. I said Howard Taft. It was President William Howard Taft. We went way back, so I knew him.
Yeah,
by his
you were
middle name.
best buds.
Billy Taft.
Yeah, Billy.
Yes.
We'd also like to thank the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University, who provides us with the ability to look back in time at survey questions and results over the decades, and that's how we've, are able to trend all of this information.
And I would also like to point out that I was disappointed. I wasn't selected because the 3 male finalists' middle name were all Michael for the Supreme Court, as is mine. So I thought I was in the running.
You're not a lawyer.
That's true. You don't have to be. But anyway, we can be seen on all forms of social media.
Yeah, and we'd like you to send your questions to pollhub@marist.edu. We'd love to hear from you. We're going to be doing lots and lots of polling in the weeks to come. And if you have an idea about something you'd like to ask, whether it's about politics or it's just about anything on your mind and you want to know what other Americans think, we'd love to ask it. You can also check out Poll Hub on social media. We are pretty much everywhere at Marist Poll on Twitter, Marist Poll on Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, and please don't forget to subscribe.